you know, your husband or your wife will say some little niggling thing that's under most circumstances wouldn't bother anyone, and poof, there'll be a big fight, which is not very helpful, and maybe you don't even know why it happens. And that would be part of being unconsciously motivated. And this sort of thing happens all the time. It seems to especially happen with things like aggression, because if you get picked on, you know, repeatedly during the day, each time that happens, the mechanisms will say they're the defensive aggression mechanisms that reside in the hypothalamus. They're sort of noting that you're taking dominance hierarchy blows and being pushed down the structure where it's unsafe, because you don't want to be at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. And then that system has a proclivity more and more to grab your behavior and your perception and react as it should, because you don't want to be pushed down the dominance hierarchy. And then if enough darts have been thrown at you for that day, then someone will push you over threshold and poof, all hell will break loose. But it's very unsophisticated behavior, and it's likely to work at cross purposes to the end that could be achieved if those impulses were properly integrated into the personality. So from the Freudian perspective, the answer would never be, don't be aggressive, partly because you don't have that choice. The answer would be, if you're going to be aggressive, which you need to be because that protects you, then be sophisticated about it. And don't pretend that it isn't there. And people do that all the time. That's part of repression. Part of what Freud described as repression can more simply be conceptualized just as self-deception. You tell yourself, well, I'm not that sort of person. And the truth of the matter is, oh yes, you are. And then there's a deeper truth underneath that, which is, not only are you, but you should be. And that applies on the dimension of aggression and on the dimension of sexuality. Because another thing that you might think about is, well, how many marriages break down because of infidelity? And then the answer to that is a substantial proportion. Often because a marriage cannot tolerate even one act of infidelity. I mean, if it's hidden, that's one thing. Maybe the marriage can still survive, even though, you know, it's on very unstable ground at that point. But if the act of infidelity is exposed or admitted to, then the contractual relationship at that point becomes radically unclear. It's very difficult to maintain a marriage relationship after that. Well, you might ask yourself, well, how is it that you stop such a thing from happening? And a psychoanalytic answer would be, well, don't try to be too good in your marriage. And what the Freudians would mean by that is, well, you don't want to be the sort of 1950s couple, each of whom sleeps in a different bed. Because even though that might fulfill some restricted notions of propriety and purity, the probability that it will satiate the more instinctive sexual desires that necessarily manifest themselves, and more importantly, that also make up part of what makes life Dionysian and rich instead of just rational and dull. Those things have to be integrated inside the marriage. And that means that it's difficult. I think this is often a difficult thing for men to do because, and maybe this is less true than it was, but I doubt it. There's a difference between the category wife and the category mistress. And the wife category is sort of a pure category. Maybe that's like mother, or maybe it's like sister, or maybe it's like aunt. And then there's the mistress category, which is more like stripper, or prostitute, or temptress, or something like that. And, well, if each category is completely separate from the other, then if you're in the married category, the mistress category is going to start looking pretty attractive. And so the trick is to get those things integrated, but that also means that the man in the relationship has to foster the development of the mistress in his wife. And often his moral propriety will stop that from happening. Or maybe his jealousy. Because one of the things that you see happening, for example, in marriages, if the wife starts to make herself, and this can also be reversed, if the wife starts to make herself look more attractive, perhaps to get in better physical shape, to dress better, to look more attractive in public, to the degree that the husband is insecure and feeling inferior, he'll interfere with that because he's afraid if she gets more attractive, then she'll attract someone who will take her away from him, so he'll do everything he can to unconsciously ensure that she's as oppressed and dowdy as she can possibly be, so that at least she doesn't run away from him screaming. And that's a standard Freudian entanglement, and something that's very characteristic of many close relationships. You see the same thing often, say, between parents and children, where the mother or the father are afraid that the child will surpass them in some way or leave them. And that's the Freudian Oedipal situation. If either parent is afraid that the child will leave, then the parents will do everything they can to undermine every movement whatsoever towards the child's independence and keep them infantile. And the infantilized child becomes dependent but unbelievably resentful, as they should, because the parent is doing everything they can unconsciously to ensure that the best part of the child is never allowed to develop. And that's an unbelievably common occurrence. Freud believed that was characteristic of most families, and that was partly because of the long developmental period that children need in order to become independent. But more complexly, it was because the dynamics between the father and the mother may be impaired in one fashion or another, sexually or from a perspective of communication, or in any of the ways that people can be mismatched, and maybe as well the couple's isolated, somewhat friendless, and so there are many things that they need to be accruing to themselves in order for their lives to be full, and they're not getting them, and so then they turn to their children for more attention than they should, for example, and encourage their children to pay more attention to them than they should. And then from the Freudian perspective, what happens is that the whole unconscious dynamic and fantasy structure of the household becomes extremely pathologized, so that what people are acting out, so to speak, is this weird intermingling of mother, father, child, and lover, where none of the roles are clearly, and parent, where none of the roles are clearly distinguished from one another.